Hello, in this tutorial I'm going to show you a video of how to use JavaScript. I will be following chapter 10 of the Leaving Cert Computer Science book by Becker and Quill. In the previous video I showed you how to create a button, and when the button was clicked an alert appeared. I'm going to continue to code from this web page that has a button, and when the button is clicked an alert appears, as demonstrated here. We're going to begin this lesson by creating an input element. An input element in HTML is simply just input. A tag. It's a standalone tag and it doesn't have any closing tag necessary. It works on its own. I'm going to put some breaks in here. Just to separate the button from the input, just to keep it looking nice. Now I can see this input element appearing on this side of my screen in my preview. And because this is HTML content, I can interact with it. I can type in my name, I can do whatever. So it takes in input from the keyboard of the user of the website. And when I click this button, an alert appears. What I want my website to do is to ask the user to input their name and then to create an alert which returns their name to them. So it's an interactive website. To do this, we need to give our input an ID. This will allow the JavaScript to communicate back up to the HTML by returning the information to the user that the user enters in the alert. So I'm just going to start by in my input putting in ID equals, and I'm going to call it name in. And again, I'm following the instructions in the chapter 10 Quill and Becker book, and that's how they do it in the book. And it makes sense because you can easily recognize it as a name that's been inputted in from the user. When you create your ID names, you can make them as simple and as easy to remember. Once you spell them correctly, your program will run. If you spell them incorrectly, your program won't run. And 95% of the errors in JavaScript are down to spelling mistakes. So always make them as simple and easy to recognize as possible and easy to spell. So now we have our input ID equals name in. We need to get JavaScript to extract the information out of the element name in. This element here is now called name in. So when I put my information in, I want JavaScript to be able to take this information and put it into the alert. Currently my alert says hello, I'm an alert, because that's what I have it set to down here. But instead of saying hello, I'm an alert, I wanted to take the input and send that back to the user. This is where the whole idea of DOM, the object model, comes into play. In brief, as the developer, you need your JavaScript to go to the HTML document, find the element with the ID name in, and communicate with it. You do this firstly by setting up a variable in your JavaScript to store the information. So we want our JavaScript to find this information up here and to communicate with it. So to do this, I'm going to set up my variable down here in my JavaScript. I'm going to start by just deleting that rather than trying to edit it, and I'm going to set up my variable here. To set up a variable in JavaScript, you have to set var, var is a keyword in JavaScript that stands for variable. So var, and the name of your variable comes next. I'm going to call this variable name because I'm taking in the person's name. So I'm going to call it name. And to assign a value in JavaScript, it's a single equals operator. So var, so I'm calling a variable, I'm calling it name, my variable is called name, and I'm setting it equal to document So this is where I'm using my DOM, document dot, and in JavaScript we use a get element by ID in order to call the ID in. So we have set up an ID name here. I want to get that element by ID, so call it in by its name, call it in by its ID. So we literally type in the function get element by ID, and you see in JavaScript you get these prompts in this in our web lab, in our code.org. It gives us these prompts. So document.get element by ID, and the name of our ID comes next, and the name of our ID is name in with a capital I, and that's coming from here. This is the ID from our input. So we're taking that element, and what we want to get out of the element is dot value, the value of that element. This takes in a string by ID. So it takes in a string by default. JavaScript takes in a string by default. And you remember that's similar to Python as well. So by default your variables are set to strings. And I'm looking for the value, so I use dot value. So this is the dot value, so it's whatever is stored in here. Don't forget your JavaScript should end in a semicolon, so put a semicolon at the end of your line. Now, how do we print this? So how do we figure out what is actually storing, what it's doing? Well, in JavaScript we use alerts to print. So I'm going to put my variable into my alert, and my variable is called name. So I'm going to refresh. And in here I'm going to go put my alert, and I'm putting name into my alert. And I can concatenate that in JavaScript by putting in a little message saying hello plus name, and just make sure you leave the space after the O. And if I refresh that and press on click me, it's just saying hello. Now if I put my name in here this time and I click on click me, it says hello Aoife. So now we have created an input that when we click on a button, our JavaScript communicates with our HTML, sends an alert out saying hello Aoife, which is the input message from the keyboard. You can put another name in here and you can see that it changes. I'm just going to change that to a capital H and try it again. And you can see that it's working perfectly. So as a recap, what we've done here is we have put in an input with an ID name in. That's just an ID that you can make up. You can call it first name in, you can call it whatever it is that you want. That's basically short enough for you to remember and not to make a spelling mistake on. So keep it simple. So name in. Then I already had my button set up from the last time, and I had it set up with an alert function, so I don't need to edit that because I have that done from the previous video. Then I set up a variable. And to set up a variable in JavaScript is just var. And I called my variable in this case name. You could call it first name if you wanted. And then this is where the idea of your DOM comes in, your document object model comes in, where your JavaScript is now communicating with your HTML. And what it's basically doing is your document, you're telling your JavaScript to go to your HTML document, which is up here, to get the element by ID. So whichever element you want to get it by ID. The ID of our input element is name in. So we want to get the name in element down here. And what do we want to get in that element? We want to get the value of it. And the value of it is, of course, whatever you put into it, as whatever the user puts into it. Then we want to create an alert that's going to say hello plus the person's name. or plus the input from the user. So we concatenate that by putting in your strings here, leave a little space after that, and then plus, and the variable goes in next. So if that was first name here, it would have to be first name here. Okay, so it's just whatever you call the variable is what's going in here. Refresh that, and it should still work. So again, it's working. Okay, thank you.